This is the September 11th, 2024 meeting of the St. Louis Unix Users Group. I'm going to go out ahead and start off with the base session. I'm going to turn it over to you, Sean. Go ahead, if you would. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. Recording is on.
Good morning, all. You should be seeing my screen coming in right now.
We do see it, yes.
So my name's Sean, and tonight I'm going to do a little bit of AI show and tell. Specifically, I'm going to present about Gemini Live and V0 by Vercel. So a couple new or updated AI tools that I think are really interesting. So I'm going to share about them. About me, I was a system administrator for several years, and then I saw this massive transition to cloud and DevOps, and I said, nope. And so I switched over to software development. My current role is a tech lead. I would also like to spend a little bit of time plugging my upcoming talk 8 days from today at the Thursday LUG meeting. I'm going to present Modern Terminal Showdown, Kitty versus Westterm.
Yay!
So if you're someone who is using the terminal application that came with your operating system, this talk is going to be should be really interesting for you because these modern terminal apps have a lot of really cool features that you might be interested in. So please, 8 days from today at the Thursday LUG meeting, be there or be square. But that's enough about that one. Let's move on with tonight's talk, starting with Gemini Live. So before we can talk about Gemini Live, we should talk about what is Google Gemini. It is Google's competitor to ChatGPT, is essentially what it is. It was originally named Bard, but they changed the underlying model, and so they changed the name of the product as well. In my opinion, this is the best AI chat for Firefox users. And the reason why I say that is because I have a hard time trusting an AI unless it provides links to its sources. And out of the major AI providers, the ones that provide links that I'm aware of are Google Gemini and Bing AI from Microsoft. Those are the two that will actually provide the sources. And Bing AI only works if you're using the Edge browser. At least last time I checked, that was the case. So if you're a Firefox user like I am, you can't really use Bing AI very easily. And so Google Gemini is your next best bet. And here on the right, I have a screenshot. And at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see these little squares. These are what I'm talking about, where it puts its sources and related content, because you know, the saying has been forever now that you can't trust everything you read on the internet. Well, if you just treat AIs like anything else you read on the internet, then you'll be pretty good to go, right? Like verify everything you read on the internet, even if it's generated from an AI, right? I mean, that's pretty much simple. And then we have Google Gemini, and every one of the major companies that provides an AI chatbot also has a subscription service. So the Google one is called Gemini Advanced. And pretty much all these AI subscription services are about $20 a month. And they pretty much all provide you priority access and access to like the upgraded models and stuff like that. Both of the subscription service from Google and Microsoft also provide an integration with their AI and their Office suite. So for Gemini Advanced, that's Gmail and Google Docs and all that. You get a little chat box in those applications where you can use your AI to help you proofread documents and stuff like that. I haven't used that too much. I don't use Office suites that often. I think the 2 bullet points at the bottom are unique to the Gemini offering. So for some reason, they lump in 2 terabytes of Google storage when you get Gemini Advanced. I have no idea why that is. It seems random to me, but whatever. And then the very bottom bullet is the one I'm excited to talk about tonight. When you sign up for Gemini Advanced, you could get access to Gemini Live. And I say you could because it's still rolling out. So yeah, but you definitely won't get access to Gemini Live unless you're a Gemini Advanced subscriber. So what is Gemini Live? It is this is from Google's ad copy, so I'm going to read it with a sleazy voice here. So Gemini Live is a more natural way to have free-flowing voice conversations with Gemini on your phone. Express your thoughts freely. Interrupt, add details, ask follow-up questions, or come back to the conversation later. Gemini listens, understands, and adapts to your conversational style in real time. So that is the marketing copy from Google's website. And what I'd like to do now is actually show the technology. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if anybody can like double click on my picture, it should blow up my camera in Zoom or put me in the center if I'm not in the center for you, because I'm going to be holding up my phone and hopefully it will come through. Okay. So I'm going to talk through it before I do it. So I'm going to hold up my phone. I'm going to hit the power button. It's going to pop up a thing. I'm going to push a button, and that's going to launch Gemini Live. Once I launch it, I'm going to have a back and forth conversation with it. So if y'all could be quiet during that time, and then later we can all have a group conversation. We can try to have a group conversation with it later if we want to. But for this first one, we'll have everybody be quiet except me, and you can see how it works, okay?
Before you start, turn off background blur if you can.
Oh, I think it'll come through, and it's not important. There's nothing important going to be shown on the screen after the first few seconds. So I'm just gonna hit this, and then you should see down here on the right, there's a button, and I just messed it up because I was talking. 1 second. Okay. What is OCI when referring to containerization technology?
OCI stands for the Open Container Initiative. It's a group that creates open standards for tools that build, ship, and run containers. Think of it as the body that makes sure all the different container technologies out there basically work the same.
Okay, you guys were able to hear her, right? It came through Zoom. Zoom didn't mute it or anything. Okay.
Yes, we heard it.
There's nothing on the screen. It's just there's 2 buttons. One says pause and one says end. So if you can't see the screen, it's not a big deal. But I just paused it so that I can make sure that you could hear her. But I'm going to go ahead and have a conversation now. And there's nothing on the screen that's important. How are OCI containers ran?
OCI containers run using a combination of things. First, you've got the container image, which is like a snapshot of the software and its dependencies. Then you need a container runtime, which takes that image and runs it in an isolated environment.
Is there a standard for container runtimes?
Yeah, there's a standard for container runtimes called the Container Runtime Interface, or CRI for short. Think of it as the middleman. It defines how container runtimes should interact with tools like Kubernetes. This way, you can swap out different runtimes.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, OCI is the standard that describes how the containers are built, and CRI is the standard that describes how containers are ran.
Yep, that's right. OCI focuses on the building and packaging of containers, while CRI handles the runtime side of things. OCI makes sure that container images are compatible across different tools and platforms.
What CRI does Kubernetes use by default?
Kubernetes doesn't use a CRI by default, but it does rely on a container runtime. Traditionally,
Okay, and it quit. I don't know. That's the first time it ever quit on me like that. It is being really slow tonight. I guess it's very popular right now. But once I quit it, it just prints out all the text on the screen. But that's basically Gemini Live. So you can imagine if you're, driving down the highway, or you're doing the dishes or something, and you need to learn something, or you have a question, how you can just talk back and forth to Gemini Live and learn something. There's no sources here, though. I just made a big deal about AIs that provide their sources are more trustworthy. Obviously, you don't get that if you're having a verbal kind of back and forth.
Can you control your phone, like bring up maps, or
Not
find
yet.
the nearest gas
No.
station?
Not with Gemini Live. With regular Gemini, they're pretty much there. Like you can ask regular Gemini to play a song and it'll find it and play it, or set a task or a reminder. But Gemini Live doesn't quite do that yet.
Could you ask it for the source while, like, it was answering and you were going back and forth? Could you say, what's your source?
Yeah. What sources do you have for the information you provided?
The information I provided about OCI and CRI is based on my understanding of the concepts and my access to a variety of reliable sources on the internet. These include the official websites of OCI and CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, documentation and guides from major cloud providers.
Can
like
you
Azure,
send those
Kubernetes.
links to my phone?
So I can't send you text messages or links via text, but what I can do is provide you with the names of some reliable sources. You can then search for them using your phone. You could try the websites for the Open Container Initiative, OC.
Is that an Android phone or iPhone?
I have Android, but I think it works on both. All right, let's do one more where I ask it about some Linux command line stuff. And for this one, if anybody wants to come off mute and interrupt her and ask a follow-up question, feel free. What is the find command on Linux?
Basically, the find command helps you track down files and folders on your Linux system. You can search for things by name.
Doesn't the
size,
ls command help you find files and folders? When would I use find instead of ls?
Yeah, the ls command shows you the files and folders in your current directory. But what if the file you're looking for isn't there? That's where find comes in. It lets you search your whole system or specific folders to find files based on lots of different criteria. For example, you could use find to locate all text files modified in the last week, or all folders bigger than a certain size.
Does find use the standard globbing when looking for several files?
No, find uses a different syntax called find expressions to search for files.
Tell me the differences between this find syntax and regular POSIX or bash style globbing.
I'm not familiar with the terms find syntax in the context of globbing or file matching. It's possible that it's a term.
I said
specific to
find
certain stuff.
syntax, not find syntax.
Absolutely, you're right. I apologize for the misunderstanding. So the main difference between find syntax and standard globbing, often bash style, is that find offers a much richer set of options for locating files. With globbing, you're limited to using wildcards like asterisk and to match file patterns. Here's a breakdown of what find can do that globbing can't. Complex criteria. Find lets you search based on file attributes like size, modification date, ownership, and permissions. You can even combine multiple criteria.
Is there a
Recursive search-
difference between the find command on Linux and the find command on Solaris systems?
Absolutely, there are some differences between the find command on Linux and Solaris systems. While both versions share the core functionality of searching for files based on various criteria, there are variations in terms of supported options and syntax. Some Linux distributions might include additional features or slight variations in behavior compared to the Solaris version.
Give me the
Here are the key
specifics
areas.
of the differences.
While the find command shares a lot of similarities between Linux and Solaris, there are some key differences that you should be aware of. Supported options, -x.dev. This option tells find to stay within the same file system. It's generally supported on both Linux and Solaris. but its behavior might have slight variations. Prune. Used to avoid descending into specific directories. The syntax and behavior of prune.
Okay. All right. I think that's good for that one. I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. And, you know, I could see myself if I'm driving down the highway or doing the dishes or something, and sufficiently bored, and there's something I want to know or understand about, I could see myself kind of using that. Now, whether it's worth $20 a month, you know, that is a completely different story. So, but yeah.
Does it search the entire internet like a regular search engine? Like if you want to do history or mathematics or chemistry, things like that?
I know it can search the web. I don't know the whole web. I don't know if it can search the whole web. I assume it just Google stuff if it needs to figure stuff out. One thing it's really good about is knowing the contents of YouTube videos. So if you ask it like what was this YouTube video about, and you give it a link, it's very good at that.
Considering the complexity of the YouTube designators for the videos, would it just pick them out by the name of the topic in the video, or do you have to give it that 11-character code that YouTube uses?
Oh, I don't know. I always just give it the link. I've not really messed with it that much, but yeah, no, it definitely doesn't just search the title. It's definitely sorry, I was just reading the chat. No, it definitely knows the contents of the video as well, not just the title and stuff. But okay.
When you say you give the link, do you type in that YouTube 11-character identifier thing?
I usually just put the whole link, the whole URL.
What, I want you to answer that question.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I agree. I want to move on to the next, because this one is really exciting. So Gemini Live, it's kind of a toy, but Vercel V0.
Can you hear me, or Sean, can you hear me? Or
yeah, I hear you.
You didn't ask that question? You're not going to ask that question
to Gemini?
Yeah.
Ask it about what again?
Why does find remove the last page of my novel?
What does that mean? I guess I don't understand the question.
It's actually something in the man page.
Oh.
If you bring up the find man page and type in novel, you'll see it.
Okay. Why does find remove the last page of my novel?
The find command is for searching files on your system, so it definitely shouldn't be removing pages from your novel. There's probably something else going on that's causing the issue. Can you describe what you mean by removing the last page? Do you get an error message when you try to open the file? If so, what does it say?
I guess it doesn't read the man page.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think if somebody
It's hoping for an Easter egg or something, something funny.
Yeah. All right. So now for the game changer. So Vercel V0. This thing is a game changer. Okay, much more than talking to Gemini. So before I talk about Vercel V0, there's some people in the audience who might not know what Vercel is. So Vercel is a company. It's a relatively new company. I'd say in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe. Well, that could be wrong, but they're relatively new. And they originally were famous for creating Next.js, which is a React meta framework. So the way it used to be is React wasn't like a framework. It was just a UI library. So oftentimes, if you were building a website, you would use React.js, but then you'd also have a bunch of decisions to make, like, oh, should I pull in React query? Should I use Axios? What other things around React should I use in order to have like a complete functional application? And so what Next.js did was they made a bunch of decisions about what to use, and they did a little bit of work to glue all these things together, and became super popular for doing that, because then you didn't have to make all these decisions every time you wanted to start a new React application, right? And for those of you that don't know what React is basically the default when it comes to creating web applications. Not web pages, but web applications probably. Like for the last, I don't know, 5 years or something, every company I've worked at you have to like give a justification to not use React. That's how popular React is. And so they became popular with Next.js. They also hired many of the React core team members away from Facebook. So they hired many of the React core team members, which put them very influential in the front end web development kind of community. And they not just the React core members either, they also hired, like, for example, the main developer behind Svelte, which is another very popular up and coming UI framework. And, you know, Vercel is a little bit controversial maybe to some people, because they are seen as kind of leading the charge to React server components, which are kind of a controversial technology. I'm not going to go fully into it, but Vercel also runs a cloud hosting platform. And and if you're running a cloud hosting platform, you need some kind of server thing to run on your hosting platform. And so some people think that they're pushing React server components just because that will funnel more people into their cloud hosting platform. But some other people think that React server components is just the next step forward as far as front-end technology and providing a better experience to their users. And so the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, as it often is. But V0 by Vercel, this is once again marketing copy, so I'm going to put my anyway, V0 is a generative user interface system powered by AI. It generates copy and paste friendly React code based on ShadCN and Tailwind CSS that people can use in their projects.
Hooray!
Yes, oh, yeah, wonderful. Okay, they also hired, I think they also hired the main person behind ShadCN as well. So they're gobbling up, which is good, right? I think for the most part, Vercel is seen neutral or favorably by most of the people in the community, right? Because they take these people who create these awesome frameworks and libraries and they give them stable jobs, right? That they can keep working on their framework. They keep the frameworks open source, you know. So I think generally Vercel is seen as positive, but there are some detractors out there, of course, as there always will be for a very popular company. I don't have a bunch of slides about Vercel V0 because it's one of these things where you just got to see it. It's incredible. You just got to see it. So this is Vercel V0 right here. I'm going to highlight this part of the text right here. Hopefully that's big enough for everybody to see. But I asked V0, create a UI list component. Each item in the list should have a way to edit and delete the data in that row. So that's like 2 sentences there that I wrote. And it generated all this output on the left, but really what it generated was this on the right. And from my 2 sentences, it generated this thing right here. So, and it's an editable list. If I come in here and I type, you know, new item and hit add, it adds it to the list. If I come in here and I update item and I click the crayon, it updates it. If I delete one, it deletes it. Let me turn this off. And I looked through this code. I did like a review of the code that it generates to make this happen, and it's good. It's really good. It's somewhere between serviceable and good. And I'd say more towards the good side. It's really good. So the code that it generates is really good. The functionality works. And this was just 2 sentences that I told it. Okay. But that's not it. I also, I wanted to see what it could do. So I said, change each row to include 2 columns, one for the name of the item and the other for the price. So if we click here, once again, that's about 2 more sentences that I told it to modify the thing. And here we go. It did. So now if I do, once again, item 999 and I hit add, it doesn't work. But if I put a price, then hit add, then it works. I can edit still, I think. Let's see. Item 78. and delete, and it all still works. And now it has my 2 columns like I asked for. Super cool. Once again, the code is all right here. It's very good code. I looked through it before. And then I said, put the list on a card or other background element to make it look more cohesive. And so it just put it on a card, plain and simple, I think, but it makes it look a lot better in my opinion, with a little bit of card around it. And then this is where I told it to change the functionality. So I said, remove the edit and delete functionality from each row. Instead, put an edit button on the entire list. Once the list level edit button is pressed, all items in the list can be modified. And so let's see what it generated here. Okay, so if I click edit, then we get this UI right here where I can go like item 999 and hit save, and it updates, and I can also still add an item like that. But we did lose the delete functionality somehow, so that's gone. But yeah, it did add it made the edit kind of save functionality here like I asked it to. Next, we come down here and I said, here we go, change the component so that, no, let's skip that one. That was not a good prompt from me. There's one more that I really want to highlight. Okay. When in edit mode, add a cancel button that will revert any changes. So let's see what it did here, because I really wanted to cancel, because there's no way to, so now we have a save button and a cancel button. I can put like new item, put $5, hit add, change this, change item 5, save. There we go. It saved both the price change and the item change. Also, I can come in here and change this and hit cancel. It cancels out. This code is getting much longer now. We're up to 150 lines of code. Still pretty good code, I would say. Pretty idiomatic React code here. Still good, still very good. And on the left side here, I'm scrolling past all this output, but it's describing what all the code does too. So you can learn, like if you're someone who doesn't know React, you can learn by asking it questions about what the code does as you go. But this is just phenomenal. Like this with the cancel button and all this is, maybe I'm just slow, but I've been doing this a while, and this is several hours of work to get this right here with the save and the cancel button using React and stuff. It's at least a couple hours minimum to get this. And the fact that I was able to generate it with just a few sentences, and it looks fairly nice using ShadCN, and the code is good, like this is a game changer. So many of my friends are just so excited about how much faster they're going to be able to do their side projects now. Like it's just incredible. And so I want to make this somewhat interactive. So we did lose the delete functionality at some point. So I'm going to see if it'll add that back for us. So add back the ability to delete an item from the list. Let's see what it does here. I think this is going to be Vercel's most popular product. I think Copilot really needs to step up its game after seeing what this can do. I think GitHub Copilot is really on the back foot now, I think, a little bit. So, because this is really cool, really cool. And what I'm going to show next is putting this into a project.
Is Copilot the alternative to the React stuff? I'm not familiar with all this stuff.
Yeah, so Copilot is an AI coding assistant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we have the delete button now, but it looks like we can delete when we're not in edit mode, which is not quite what I want. Could have been more specific. Looks like everything else still works though. Okay, so change the delete function, change the functionality so that the delete icon is only present in edit mode. Okay, and then after we do this demonstration, then I will show you how to put it into a project. And then after we put it into a project, we can try to create one of the most annoying components to create in all of front-end development, the data table. And you think I'm joking, but I'm not. Data tables are super annoying, okay? Writing that sorting logic, and especially if there's a search bar and all that, pagination, so tedious. But I'm sure I have a strong, I've never tried it, but I have a strong feeling that this is going to be able to do it pretty well. But we'll try it together. So, okay, so now when we go to edit mode, we see our delete. Love it. Okay, so what if I delete and then cancel? Oh, it canceled it. Delete item 1, cancel. Yeah, see, look at that. That's so good. Okay, so now let's say I have this component, super happy with it. Love the fact that it worked and it was so easy to generate. I have a VS Code project here. I have a React project here in my VS Code. And what this is this is just a very basic React project with shadcn already installed. So basically I spent 20 minutes this morning following their guide online. Okay, that's all I did. And so now if I come in here, they have this add to codebase button. So I'm going to click that. I'm going to copy this command because that's what you're supposed to do with code, right? You're supposed to copy commands from the internet and yoink them right into your terminal, right? That's always what you do. Come on. So I'm going to do that. Okay, and we see that it added a components folder here. And these are the shadcn components, which if you want, we can get into what shadcn is and why it's so cool. And then this is the code that we were just looking at on the website. Copy and pasted it right into my project for me. And so now all I have to do is go to this app tsx file, and I'll put editable list, whatever, and save that. And I'm going to run the dev server, npm run dev here. Gave me a URL. Boom. There it is in my project. The delete icon is really small, but it should all work. Let's see here. There we go. Cancel works. If I change a price, save works. If I delete, save works. If I cancel, if I do all these things at the same time, negative numbers, how does that work? It works. Okay. Look, this is great. This is incredible. Like maybe y'all aren't impressed. This is amazing to me. So let's go back to V0. I can find it. And let's do something new. Let's do the dreaded data table. Create a paginated sortable data table with 5 columns. Let's see what it does. I'm excited. Oh man, I don't know what that is. I just saw some weird code that I'm not sure what it is. Okay, I believe it's finished.
It'd be interesting to have a quick look at that code when it's done.
Yes, we will. The sorting is not working. So I'm sorting here. First of all, these sort icons are not spaced right. Okay, so the sorting numbers is working, I believe. Nope, no, it's not. That is very disappointing.
Well, it toggles to unsorted, right? It toggles from sort.
Oh, it's going sorted, other way, and then turning it off. Oh, interesting. I've never seen that before.
Is that what is happening? I'm not, I can't tell.
That is what's
I-
happening. So we're sorting it lowest first, then highest first, and then turning off the sorting. I'm not used to that.
behavior many times.
What's that?
I've seen that many times.
I'm not familiar with that's weird. Why would you want that? Like, no, make it random again. I like the random. Can you make it random for me?
No, it's not necessarily random. It's undoing a sort and going back to what it was previously.
Can you believe this? Look at this pagination. And it did sample data. I didn't even tell it to do sample data. You know what I mean? I didn't tell it what the categories were. I didn't tell it what the columns were. I mean, this is, man, this is so good. And it works. I can't believe this. You know, I've spent days, okay, making a generic data table that could accept any width of data. Okay, now we're gonna add a super.
I didn't know that they just didn't steal it from another website somewhere.
It stole it from ShadCN for sure. And yeah, just I mean that's what AI is doing, right? It's just robbing the internet for content. Okay, so this. Oh. Okay, so I see what this is doing. So this is an array of 3 elements, and this is indexing into that array a random number between 1 and 0 and 2, or 1 and 3 probably. 0 and 2 for sure. So this must be creating the mock data. Yeah. And it's all TypeScript code too. So good. Not JavaScript. Okay, now let's do a super hard feature. So add the ability to pin a row to the top. The pinned row should stay on the top regardless of any sorting or pagination the user does. It'll never get it. It can't get it. This is an advanced table feature, man. It can't do this. There's no way.
You haven't tried this yet?
Oh no, I literally just did that one thing, and I was just so scared by it and blown away by it that I haven't done anything else. I'm gonna use this all the time though. Okay, wait. Let's go down here and pin number 57. Okay, we got 57 at the top. Look at that, dude. Can you believe that? Unpin it. Let's pin number 3.
Can you pin multiples, or is it like a toggle?
Yeah, let's try it. Oh no, you can only pin 1. No, we need to pin multiple. Allow multiple rows to be pinned. Okay. After this, I'm done. Okay. I've been long, and I went way over the half hour that I'm trying to stick to. But man, this is so cool. I hope you guys are getting my enthusiasm, my excitement's coming through. This is just so phenomenal.
I am so impressed by this.
It's
Consi-
I love
It's-
React, and this is good.
Considering how bad the Zoom speech to text is compared to what your results you're getting, it's amazing.
still 51.
It must be using a much better speech to text interpreter for this Gemini or whatever it is, AI.
He's typing this in. He's not talking to it.
Oh, he's typing. Okay. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Gemini, he was talking. He was talking to Gemini. This is
Okay. All right. Well, then that makes sense.
You can pin multiple, and it's sorting the pins as well as the data below separately. You see this? Like this is price high to low for the pins, and then high to low for the non-pinned. And then if I sort it again, it does price, well, that's unsort, but price low to high for the pins and low to high for the unpinned. You see that? That's incredible.
That's
That's
amazing.
Okay, I'm done. But this thing is game changer. I was telling y'all this would be exciting, and this is game changing. But anyway, I'm done here. This is V0 by Vercel. So cool.
John, that's amazing. That is amazing.
I know you can get code out of ChatGPT, but I don't think anything like this.
I know.
Wow.
GitHub Copilot has to step his game up. I'm telling you, who is not going to use React and Shad CN? Like, nobody can compete with that, right? Like, you have to spend hours to do that in Angular, or Svelte or whatever, and then it could just generate it like that and do good.
This is going to be a neat tool. Looks really fun to play with and productive. Wow, what a concept. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, Sean Tweehouse. Sean put this together in a little over a week. I think he was thinking about it before that, though, because obviously it's something that was intriguing. So, all right. So we're in the GUI middle of our meeting. I think most of you have been with us before, but just a quick refresher. We do a tutorial, a basic tutorial on the front. That's what Sean just did. Then we do a main talk on the back. That's still coming up. And in between, we do the introductions, the announcements, and a brief little Q&A. And that's where we are now, that GUI middle of the meeting. So with that, welcome. This is the St. Louis Linux Unix users group. We're kind of open source of all types. And oh boy, we've been going quite a few years. So by all means, take a look at our web homepage. We've got the archive out there. We've got a lot of both recordings and sometimes just the slide deck or notes from meetings in the past. And so it's out there and available.
Who are you?
See. Oh, I'm Gary Meyer. I'm the president of the group right now and also our MC for tonight. That other voice you hear, friendly face there in the middle of the screen, that's Stan Reichert. Stan's our vice president, and Stan just gets everything done. I mean, he's amazing. He somehow has his finger on every button in this organization and keeps it running. So thank you, Stan.
Welcome. It's too many buttons, and
too many
fingers,
buttons, not enough fingers.
My fingers are worn to the nub.
That's it. That's it. Our treasurer, Lee Lambert's not here tonight. He's usually one of the hosts of the meeting. Our secretary is Ken Johnson. I think he also isn't here right now. If anyone would care to be the monitor of the chat room tonight, it always helps to have an extra pair of eyes looking at the chat, just in case somebody doesn't have a microphone available and wants to ask the speaker a question or something. Somebody can monitor the chat and let us know if there's something in there that's a pressing issue. And in general, not during the meeting, but long-term topic wrangler. If anybody wants to help find new presenters, new topics to talk, we'd love to have your assistance. It isn't a job that necessarily requires a lot of FaceTime or online time with us as much as figuring out who might be a good speaker. So, and of course, if anyone would like to speak, we'd love to hear from you. So moving on to the next slide. Click. Well, maybe not moving to the next slide.
8 days from now. I see it.
8 days from now. 8 days from now, next week, is the St. Louis LUUG meeting, Linux user group meeting. It's similar to this meeting in that there's a prepared talk. So there'll be a speaker that night. Sean, you still with us?
He told us earlier what it was going to be. I can't remember, so I'll have to play the recording back.
Okay. Also, it'll be on our calendar and website, so you can pull it up there.
It's new terminals. It's about new terminals.
See. 5 days after that is the new LUUG meeting, the new Linux meeting. The difference of the new Linux meeting, there is no prepared talks for that meeting. It's nothing, no particular topic for the night. It's basically whoever shows up to the meeting that night and says they're the newest user of Linux, the least experienced, they get to ask the first question. And everybody else has to try and come up with a good answer to their question. And so we hope that a lot of our more experienced users are there who can help answer some of those questions. and of course, any other new users. A lot of times, you'll be there to help fine tune or maybe give that, just a couple weeks ahead of somebody answer that's really helpful. So yeah, that's a good thing to come to. Let's see. Anything else on that slide? Nope, Stan. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We need help updating our server from Debian 10 to 11. And still need some volunteers, and Lee is the lead on that, and he's kind of been overwhelmed lately, just like everybody else is overwhelmed. This is a volunteer organization, and we could use some help on that. I'd like to mention that Sean Tweehouse has been working on a new SLUUG website, and at some point we're going to preview that, and it'd be up to Sean when we do that. I'm thinking we're getting real close to switching over to what he's done. Is there a call for any other announcements tonight? After
We'll
this, go ahead.
I'm just going to note real quick, this is 9/11, and a big thanks to all of the first responders who helped out on that date, and big thanks to the passengers on the plane that went down in Shanksville. They decided that they were going to take matters in their own hands and do their own defense. So they were real heroes that day too.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Gary.
Nothing else, Stan?
Thanks for that, Gary. Those were real heroes.
Yeah. I've showed a lot of these slides earlier, so we're just going to go right through them. We talked about the other meetings. We've got their mailing lists and a calendar. These are our mailing lists. And the presentation, tonight's presentation will be up on our site. And the SLUUG and the St. Louis meetings are the ones that are recorded and posted. We do not record well, I do record those other meetings, but they're not posted. The new Linux meeting and the Slack meeting. Only those primary meetings are recorded.
Okay.
Also, anyone might be recording here.
That's true. So you never know when you're being recorded.
Call for help.
So, call for help. Certainly at the end of the meeting tonight, we traditionally have just everybody can just keep asking questions either on topic of tonight or other topics. But right now, if there's anybody who just needs to get in a quick question here before our main speaker, if anybody needs to do some quick call for help here early in the evening.
Now's your chance. Going once? Going twice?
3 times. Okay. Okay. Our main speaker this evening, he's spoken to us, I believe, 3 times before. Steve Borrelli. Steve comes back to us about every 2.5 years, or we get him to come back to us about every 2.5 years. And so I happen to be speaking with Steve or texting with Steve, emailing, whatever, about a month ago, and was talking to him, and he happened to say, well, I'd love to come to the meeting this month, but the meeting this month is the same time that Linus Torvalds is doing the keynote address here in Hong Kong, and I'm at the meeting here in Hong Kong, and so I'll be listening to Linus rather than you guys tonight. Well, that sounds like something of interest, Stephen. And so Stephen very kindly has decided to fill us in on what I saw in Hong Kong and make some comments about his 2 favorite presentations from the conference there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Borrelli.
Right. Thank you. And I just want to say the presentation before this was great. That was super interesting. So thank you for doing that. All right, let me share. And this is going to be kind of an interesting presentation for me. Can you see my screen, folks?
Yes, we do.
All right. Yeah, so, and I've got the logo fixed. I showed up earlier and I had the wrong logo on my presentation, so I was able to fix that.
Thank you.
Yeah, what we're going to talk about today is basically kind of like a meta presentation. And it's going to be about some of the things that I saw in KubCon China. And Gary kind of gave the backstory about it. Just a little bit about myself. I've been around for a while, so like my first Unix, I think I should say that, is where a Unix group here is Next Step. So I had a Next workstation when I was in college, which was super awesome. In my career, I was an AX admin for a very long time. My first Linux was, I remember this, was like if the folks remember this, you used to be able to buy Linux like from these places online where they'd ship you CDs and books, right? Before the internet was really fast at downloading things. So that was my first Linux. So I've been in the Unix space or the Linux space for a pretty long time, most of my career. I currently focus on cloud and Kubernetes, especially cloud automation and infrastructure. So that's what I've been probably doing since about the time that Docker came out. And I currently work for a company that's based out of Seattle, but I work remotely. I'm a solutions architect, and the project I focus mostly on is something called Crossplane, which is a way of provisioning infrastructure. And this is a project I actually approached Upbound to join them that I think is probably one of the most promising things in the entire infrastructure space. So that's just a little bit about me. So as part of that, the origin of this talk, as Gary said, I was accepted with my colleague to go speak at Open Source Summit in Hong Kong, which is one of the KubCons. And as part of that, I didn't even realize that Linus was speaking there. But as Gary, I was going to this meeting when Gary sent me the invite. One of the things that was super interesting about being in Hong Kong is you see this picture here. We met some of the maintainers from this language called KCL, which I also offered. I may talk at some time in the future. I think it's, at least in the Kubernetes space, we're using it pretty heavily for configuration management and writing a lot of the configuration code that we do with Crossplane. So it was a really good time for us to coordinate. All right. Something else about this talk, I'm going to be talking about other people's talks. So I think it would be really good if people just chime in, because I usually give like technical talks where I've prepared and go through a bunch like an agenda. And here I'm just going to kind of follow the slides. And I don't know if that's going to be improvement on actually watching the talks themselves, right? They're both pretty good speakers. But the first one we're going to talk about, oh, this is my talk here.
I'll start with the question. So wait a minute, KCL, I thought Kubernetes loved YAML.
No, this is actually Kubernetes is a declarative system, right? So their interface, you apply either JSON or YAML, but they're not opinionated about how you generate that. So in our case, we use KCL. So the way Crossplane works, if some people might be familiar with tools like Ansible or Terraform, is you can group resources together, right? So in Crossplane, we could group a bunch of resources together, and when we write that grouping, it's something called a composition. And we could write that in any language, right? Because Crossplane has this pipeline. So we've been using KCL for that. And then it spits out the YAMLs, and then the providers take over and provision those. So there's a lot going on there. If you don't know anything about Kubernetes, there's a lot of concepts there, but Kubernetes has a very separation of concern type of architecture, right? So each component focuses on doing one thing. And in this case, the KCL generates the logic for creating those YAML files.
So it's almost like a transpiler then, or something like that, right? Like KCL to YAML or something?
Yes, yeah. It's dynamic though, right? Because like Kubernetes runs controllers, right? So it's running continually. So it observes all the resources, right? Like let's say you have a Kubernetes cluster out in AWS, it will observe all the resources, pull in their data, and then run that data through a pipeline of steps. And those steps could be written in any language, right? It's like GitHub Actions, but we've been increasingly leaning towards KCL. There's things like the Pickle language, Q. I know this is Kubernetes a little bit more, so it's kind of out of what's in this group here, but we use Go templating too, which is kind of like just text templating, with the brackets. You could use that too, but increasingly we've been using KCL. So it's a very well-run project. So yeah, the Crossplane thing is it's a big thing in its own. Right. So we're going to talk about two talks today. The first one is by Kroah-Hartman, and he's going to talk about the security process, which I thought was super interesting. And I hope this is useful for everyone. And I kind of put links to the presentation and video here so that you could go follow it later. I think this is a pretty good talk, especially the first half of it. Just talking about the process of Linux, right? How Linux is released, what their philosophy is. And I think it helps inform a lot of other things in the software industry, as Linux is really probably one of the signature software projects, I would say almost of all time. It's probably one of the biggest, whether it's private or public, it's probably one of the most well-run projects. So let's talk about it. And I'm just going to kind of paraphrase here what he's talked about. But Linux is massive, right? Like it's 38 million lines. But what's really interesting here is the vast majority of that is device drivers. So what most people use is a tiny fraction. And what was really interesting here is that the complexity actually almost feels backwards, right? Like the servers are actually using the least amount of code. And it's things like phones that end up using the most, right? Because I think the example here was that the open source Android drivers has like 300 different drivers that need to be built in. So this is kind of surprising because we tend to think of like servers as being the most powerful devices they are, but they tend to be much more limited in terms of what gets shipped and attached to them.
I think the drivers is also like the main lock-in thing too, right? Like you don't hear anybody else talking about making a new kernel, right? Like, if you think about the Linux ecosystem, like especially like on the desktop side, right? There's so much competition and choice. KDE and GNOME, is like an example, but the kernel, there's none of that. There's just Linux, right? And that's because nobody wants to start at 0 drivers and then go all the way up to 30 million lines of driver code, right?
Yeah, the scope.
PhD camps would take exception to that, as well as the Solaris Aluminos camp.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's very hard to compete with Linux. Well, just the sheer scope and velocity of the project is kind of amazing, actually. Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to talk about in this talk. Just the sheer scope of it is really impressive. So this is what he was talking about too. They do 9 changes an hour, they average, which is a really high velocity. And this is where things really start getting interesting. When I started with Linux many years ago, I said about it, I started with Red Hat 2.032, and I know if folks were around for those early days, sometimes there was like big delays between kernels, like there could be a year or two, and, waiting for like 2.2 and 2.4. They changed that a while ago, and now they're on a very restricted release cycle. It's basically every 9 weeks they ship a new stable kernel. Which is different than in the past when they would sometimes, iterate between, test kernels and stable. An important thing about Linux is that going forward, the version numbers don't really mean anything. It's usually when they get up to about 20 or so, like 6.20, they just up the first number. So it's not like, in computing, we could oftentimes be very conservative with the first number, right? Like we only change it if there's a breaking API change. That tends to be the convention for a lot of projects. Here at Linux, they don't really consider that. They'll just, whenever it's convenient for them, they'll just increase the number. So we're probably, a couple years away from 7.0. Another big thing is that they have this promise that they're not going to break user space, and then they add on purpose, right? So this has been their promise since like for the last 17 years. So this is all really important because some of these are like not conventional for other projects. There are projects that don't mind breaking, downstream. And then there's also, this concept of having all stable releases, which is a big change from how Linux started, when they used to have like test and development kernels.
Question.
Yes.
You mentioned that they're trying to not break user space, and maybe it's the user space versus kernel space that's the problem. My understanding is there was actually a little bit of hostility towards ZFS and changing some things in kernel that broke ZFS, and that was done on purpose. Understand it.
I don't have any context on that. I don't know. Does anyone else? That's a really interesting.
Could you repeat that? I don't know if I totally understood what the thought was there.
Fair enough. I may be wrong, but my understanding is there was a change made in the kernel on purpose with full knowledge that it would break some aspect of ZFS. As in, everybody that was using ZFS on Linux, it was a don't go past this kernel version and don't go past this version of the ZFS utilities and libraries. Something massively changed in the kernel, and it took a lot of effort to get past it. And it teetered on licensing, and it was for ZFS almost like years ago we had the untainted versus tainted kernels when you loaded external drivers or modules. It was something on that level, I believe. And it seems to me like it was diametrically opposed to the trying to not break userland. This was one of the few things I've heard of that it's, nope, we're breaking it. We know we're breaking it. We're going full speed ahead, breaking it. Tough cookies. We'll see if I can find some more on it.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
But ZFS on Linux, there's a lot of interesting things around licensing, and it could have been embroiled in that. And the back end might be trying to protect the kernel from a legal licensing standpoint and expelling something they thought was potentially dangerous.
Yeah, I did see a quote from Linus about 2 years ago where he said he was telling people don't use ZFS. He won't accept any ZFS stuff in the kernel because of the licensing and how litigious. He specifically cited how litigious Oracle is. Java, you know. So.
Going through the way the kernel is developed is really interesting too, because they have two different tracks that run in parallel. So whenever they open up a release window for the next release, like for 6.11, usually the patches have to be ready immediately, right? Like if they're not available when the merge window is open, they're just going to have to wait to the next release cycle, which I think is really interesting. If you worked in a software a while, sometimes you know that like there's always pressure to delay things for the next release. In this case, because they're time-based, and this is something I actually really like. I've seen it, you know, when you get to a time-based release, sometimes it's not as bad to miss certain patches in. So they do two things. So they have a merge window opens for the next release, and you can see here, these are the RC releases, and they do those roughly once a week before they get to 6.11. So there's going to be like 8 or 9 of those versions. And as I said before, all those new patches have to get in at the beginning of the merge window. Then on the other side, they do stable releases, right? And they do patch releases on those, and those are also 1 to 2 a week. And you see that they tend to increase, especially on older kernels, they can increase into the hundreds of releases, right? So, and then after 9 weeks, another, like the 6.11 will be cut, and they'll start the process alone again.
Which is those are the merge windows that you're talking about? I don't
you see the blue dots there, the merge window for 6.11. So as soon as, so if you start at 6.10 and you say we're going to start the 6.11 development process, as soon as you open up that merge window, Linus says that all patches have to be ready to go, right? Like if they're not ready to go when the window opens, they're going to have to wait for the next release. So you can't come in halfway through and say I want to bring a new feature in. It has to be there at the beginning of the cycle.
Okay.
And it's a 9-week cycle, right? So, you know, 2 months or so, you're going to have to wait for the next to get it into shape. On the other side, the green ones are the stable kernel releases, which are released pretty much once a week, and those just have bug fixes in them.
Okay. Oh, I was reading it upside down. No wonder I couldn't follow.
It's going down.
Yes,
Just,
thank you.
um, I, so rules for stable kernels, because obviously we talked about the windows for the development kernels, but stable is something different. And I put what's here. There's a huge amount of documentation on the kernel.org. And I have to say, as someone who's been in cloud computing for a long time, I haven't focused on Linux a lot. The last time I really focused on kernel numbers was around the time of Docker, when we were merging in different file systems, like, overlay FS and things like that. Since then, it's become a little more abstracted out to me. So what they're saying here is that, fixes, those stable releases that come out, that can't be bigger than 100 lines, and it can't really modify too much behavior, right? It either fixes a bug or just adds a device ID. That's it. Anything else probably needs to go into the next release. There's also long-term kernels, right? So this is something that the Linux community has been releasing longer-term kernels, because obviously the other kernels only last for 9 weeks, right? They last for 2 months. So usually what they do is they wait to the end of the year, like the last kernel release of the year will be a long-term release. And I put the list here, and one thing you could see here is that they've got a 4.19, 5.4, 5.10, and you could see the number of intermittent releases that they've done, those stable releases with less than 100 lines of patch code, all those little patches that they put in. It gets up to 200, right? Like, so they release a lot of stable versions. One thing that's really amazing about the Linux project is just how much software they can release and ship. You're looking at hundreds of versions a month, across 5 or 6 different kernel lines. It's really impressive.
This LTS, is this what a lot of the distros base their long-term support intentions on, based on this kernel release?
They do, but this is changing, right? Because that's an excellent question, because the Linux community, especially the developers, are encouraging people to go more on a rolling basis just to keep up with them. Like, it used to be that, like, you'd get a Red Hat 5 and it would have a fixed kernel, and then Red Hat would spend the next 5 years patching it. What they want to do is have just people keep up with the kernels, right? So what they're doing is, it's something a little different. They're just frequently releasing stable kernels, and they're all compatible with each other. They're hoping to have that compatibility guarantee. So they just are encouraging people to keep up with them. Because the big thing of this is that Greg, who is one of the security maintainers of the previous branches, is that they're cutting long-term support, right? So they just, last September, it used to be that they would cover long-term kernels for 6 years. Last September, they cut it down to 2 years. And the big reason for that was, one, a lot of people are not using the older kernels. Another reason, it takes very senior engineers to maintain those older kernels, just because they're so different from what's today, like knowing what to put into them. So yeah, and you can see here just the number of changes a day. The older kernels don't get as many patches. So what's going to happen is they're really going to start, these older kernels are going to start falling off in terms of support, and you're basically going to have about 2 or 3 years that you get out of a kernel.
As I understand it, the Debian maintainers, they do security up to like 2 years, and then those are the main people that are working on the Debian kernel distribution. And then for the next 4 years, they have a whole different set of people that are coming in and dealing with the security issues. Is that what's going on? Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how Debian runs. Are there any other Debian folks here?
Okay.
I find your comment about the 2 years long-term kernel support somewhat odd, or their choice of it, as in that most servers that I've been around, when they're deployed, They
Well,
particularly,
I'm not sure exactly if it's 2 years. It might be longer.
no, I'm referring to,
That cutoff. All right.
yeah. But I've seen a lot of servers that when it's deployed, it's basically on a given kernel version, um, minus patches, but stays with the main kernel version. Now they may deprecate a kernel version before the hardware is retired.
Yeah, the Linux people, that's why they're doing all these releases. They're moving towards just keep up, right? Like it's not, I think a lot of folks who were maintaining servers in the past, like things were a lot more fixed and when you patched them, now they're pushing more and more just to keep up with the head. And I got the site here, this end of life date.linux, and I thought it was really interesting. They actually have a graph of all the different support for the different Linux kernels. So you can see here, this ends when the kernels end. This is just the main kernels, obviously not whatever Debian or Red Hat has within their kernels.
Right.
But yeah.
But I think Red Hat or pick your SUSE or whoever is going to be a little bit harder pressed to continue supporting a given kernel after the kernel maintainers have stopped supporting that kernel.
Yeah. So just something to keep in mind.
Could you repeat the name of that site? I'll type it in the chat.
Let me see if I can copy it. Hold on here. Yeah, let me escape because it's my where's my chat? You know, it's Zoom, right? Like it's where did it put my little chat window? Somewhere. Here we go.
I see it.
All right, there we go. I just posted the whole thing, but okay. Yeah, so this is interesting. Things like that had changed since I had been really involved with like looking at what's happening in the Linux world. So that's kind of the release process. And just going back in summary of that, just thinking about, how Linux is changing, right? They're getting to pretty much a well-oiled machine that is like shipping constantly. And I think their expectations are that people are just going to keep up. And so it might be a different way of thinking as things go in the future. A lot of workloads now are cloud-based. They're immutable, right? Their devices, there's at least on the cloud side or the compute side. And then when we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the vast majority of Linux devices are actually embedded and handheld. And that's a whole other problem. Right. One thing that's, if you're not aware of this in the Linux community, they don't like to separate out security issues from other bugs, right? They think this is, and when we talk about Linus's keynote, he's going to say the same thing. They consider bugs just bugs. Like if there's a security issue, they don't want to treat it differently than anything else. And the Linux community is actually very aggressive about some of the things that are normal in the security industry, and like in terms of how long for notification and things like that. The Linux community generally doesn't play games with that. So just so you know, if you're in the Linux world, any security issue is just going to be classified as any other bug, and they'll go resolve it. All right. But hardware is treated differently, right? Like it's in Linux, like the software bugs, like so. I don't know if I have this slide here. So the way Linux works with software bugs is that they have a kernel security team. So this is all stuff that has been getting built up over the years. And I'll talk about some stuff that just happened this year. But there's a kernel security team that's basically reactive now within Linux, and their job is to basically triage all the bugs that are coming in and decide how to, give those out to each of the maintainers. Something really important about here is that there's no early announcements that other projects may have, like for people who are insiders. And the second thing too is that there's only a 7-day embargo on software bugs once they resolve it. So sometimes, companies will want to have a PR release or something like that when an issue is fixed, and they want to delay the fix. The Linux community doesn't play that game. They basically say, once we fix something, you can hold on to it for 7 days, and then you have to talk about it. So So yeah, the other thing is hardware security issues are, if you remember, there's some of our favorite chip companies have had some hardware issues in the past. And so those have actually taken years. Like one thing Linus had talked about in his is that they had the knowledge for years about some of these hardware bugs and they couldn't talk about it. So hardware is different because it takes a long time to get those fixed. They do have like a special encrypted email list for hardware issues because it's such a security concern. Yeah, and a lot of the biggest companies are like on this secret list or this encrypted list. So, and as I said before, I'll share these, I'll upload these slides, but there's a link here. There's actually great documentation on the Linux site about some of this. This is the big change that happened this year. So Linux is now a CVE numbering authority. What that means is like whenever you see a vulnerability, you'll see something like CVE, 2204, 1601 or something like that. And in the past, people were assigning these to Linux. Like they'd find a bug in Linux and then they'd assign it to the project. And it was very hard to manage. And there were also some vendors who were doing some shady things about like creating CVE so that they could get fixes into the kernel, like Red Hat. And a big driver for this too is that there's EU regulations coming in that like open source projects need to own their own security. So just this year, Greg, who's giving this presentation, actually started, like he took over it. So Linux now is issuing their own CVE. So nobody else can issue a CVE against Linux. The project is doing it itself. And of course, the talk is like, they're generating 60 a week, right? So I think we're starting to see how the picture works here, right? Linux is a super high velocity project. And they're controlling now all their CVE generation. So what is a CVE? So it's a common vulnerability and exposure, and they're a way to track security vulnerabilities. And it's pretty broadly defined. So this is from Greg's, anything that like can cause a crash or a buffer overflow or logic errors or lots of things like that. Anything that they determine. And this is actually in the CVE definition, right? So they explain what could be a vulnerability. And then what happens is the Linux security team will get a bug report in and they'll triage it, one for the maintainer and two, whether it needs to be classified, a CVE needs to be generated for it. Obviously, they're not going to classify it as a security bug because they don't do that. It'll just be a bug with a CVE on it. And yeah, one thing here they're talking about, like a lot of things that are triggering CVEs right now are these panic on warns. So basically, this is embedded on billions of devices. So if they run across one of these, they have to open up a CVE. But yeah, anyway, this is like one example he made of one of the things that's causing a lot of those 60 CVEs a week. All right. This is one of the things that's really good is that you could search like all the Linux CVEs. When they publish it, they're going to say, and that, when they fix the issue and report what it does, they're going to say what versions and what files are updated. And I looked, there's multiple search engines. I went to the US National NIST, and I was able to just like do a quick search on Linux and see what's affected. So yeah, you could look there. And as he said before, very few CVEs are applicable to the average user, right? Like outside of the core kernel, which is a small percentage, the vast majority of these are being on the drivers. All right. So this is the last slide here. Greg put this in the slide. So I had to put his name over here, right? Like, because it's not me saying this quote, it's Greg, right? And then when I thought of this, I was like, oh, I should just put the thing in from the office here because it's like the exact same thing. So, but this here, his last message here is really like what he's saying, right? Like they're pushing everybody to use the latest is stable and long-term kernels, right? So getting back to that, I think they're trying to discourage patched kernels that are out there that people are like patching. They just want you to fix the, stay on upstream and help get things merged in upstream. So
with that, because, if it's in the Linux kernel, but a problem for another architecture that I'm running, it doesn't affect me, even though I'm not at the latest and greatest. So.
Yeah, they move very fast. And yeah, so it was a really good talk. He gets more into the security thing that I didn't think really was applicable, but I just thought his talk was just like a really good overview of the Linux release process, how things work. I thought it's pretty valuable. The next thing is we're going to talk about is Linus. He actually gave a keynote here. I was pretty excited. I did not know when I went to the conference that he was going to be there, so it was pretty exciting. And he basically did like a Q&A session, and this will be a little harder because Linus, he doesn't really do a presentation. He does more of a QA. So I did put a link here for it. It's about 30 minutes and it's great. I honestly think, I don't know if I'm going to do justice to it because I actually think if you could come across these two doing a presentation, it's pretty entertaining if you're into this stuff and it's super informative all the time. So I don't know if it's actually just valuable for me actually to talk about it versus everybody just going off and seeing it themselves. But we're going to do the former. So this was really interesting. Let me get to the next slide. Oh, let me just stop that. I'm not gonna, I have the slide linked here in my, so hopefully it'll load if I upload the presentation. So really the thing about this, why they do this format, and they do this all the time, they seem to go all over, is that like Dirk is head of open source at Verizon, and obviously we know who Linus is. And they work together as a team. So you'll see them actually doing this presentation several times around. It's not the same presentation every time. Linus hates public speaking. He doesn't, well, he hates prepared and giving a talk. What he really enjoys is that doing these Q&A sessions. He doesn't know the questions in advance, right? So Dirk, creates all the questions, based on what he thinks is interesting, and then they just basically have a conversation for half an hour. So it's usually pretty entertaining, and you get a lot of interesting information about it. The first thing they were talking about was we're a third of a century into Linux, right? So, for folks who are, not familiar with the origins of it, it's 1991 that he started working on it like in April, and by August, which is just a couple of weeks ago, 33 years ago, he released the first version of it, right? So he's been working on it. And so, yeah, his comment here was it's almost done. Like he said, he started then saying it's almost ready, and now he's like, it's almost ready still. So that was his comment about this. It was really interesting. And I guess for this crowd here, how many people have been using Linux for a very long time, and how many people are like new to it?
From the names I'm familiar with, it's 95% of the people. There's maybe 2 people here I haven't seen their name before, but everybody else here has used Linux in some form or another.
Yeah, for years. I'm saying like for years or for recently or.
Oh, for me, it's over 20 years.
Wow. Very cool.
I think for me, it's probably over 20 years. And Stan?
I loaded it as my main driver in 1995.
Wow.
That's it. Yeah, very nice.
When I first saw it, I was coming from the Windows DOS world, and I looked at it, and DOS had about 60 commands or 90, or I forget, whatever. And I first looked at that first bit of Linux. It had more than 350 commands, and I was like a pig in mud. I just thought it was great. And I thought to myself, if they never improve it at all, I would still be happy. And that was way back then.
Stan, I don't know if the visual image you just gave us is really going to help the promotion of Linux, but thank you. Pig and mud.
I grew up on a farm, and pigs were happy in the mud. And they really were.
Okay. Anyway, back to you, Stephen.
Yes. Yeah, the next thing is they started talking about the next release. Like we talked about, if you remember with the Greg talk, like that we were in the 6.11, right, release cycle. So I guess they're probably getting close now. It's been a few weeks since this talk. So you'll probably see 6.11 coming out soon. But what's really interesting here is that, because of like a lot of the AI workloads that are now coming onto Linux, they've been actually spending a lot of time going back into memory things. So he felt like after 20, 30 years, it's still surprising that they're still doing things at the core kernel concepts. And, that's kind of, and let me see if I have the next one. One of the things here is I thought this might actually be an interesting talk for the group at some point. there's this thing that they're trying to get in 6.11. It's been going back and forth for a while, and it's an extent, it's a scheduler in user land that you could go implement your own schedulers using eBPF in user space. And there was some tragedy in one of the developers' families, so it wasn't going to be included. But then now they're looking to include it in 6.12. But I linked to actually a talk here about a presentation about it. It's probably outside of my realm of experience, but I think it'd be interesting for a future talk, somebody just to look into this, because there's a lot of excitement about this, about especially people who are like hyperscaling and looking at different ways to, change, because BPF is really kind of changing the core of Linux itself and making it more programmable. So like you could see the kernel eventually becoming like an engine for running BPF programs or something like that. So I thought this would be interesting for folks, like just to take a look at this presentation. It just came out in June. Let's see where it is here. The pluggable event scheduler, and there's like a PDF and everything to it. I think they're working on it at Meta, Facebook. So
That's crazy, because I thought with eBPF you couldn't have for loops, because you can't just run any code inside the kernel. So you have an infinite loop or something else. So I didn't think you could do for loops inside eBPF. So I guess that's not true anymore, because I can't imagine you can do a scheduler without a single for loop.
I don't. Yeah, I honestly do not. Let's see, BPF. We're going into here. SCEDX, run a BPF, GPL. Yeah, so I don't see load balancing. Yeah, they don't say anything about like maybe just schedulers, maybe just for the
Oh, I see. So they probably do anything that needs like looping and user space, and then they only call the eBPF to do certain tasks that don't need that stuff.
yeah. So that makes sense, right? Like the looping would be in the user space, and then you could have a custom. So yeah, this was a big feature that people have been asking for. So it's looking now like the 6.12. So this came up as a point of discussion. So yeah, I think this would be actually an interesting topic. Just BPF in general is, they're using it in the Kubernetes world, and some of the sidecar-less, service meshes and things like that. They talked about the future, and I think this is something that's really interesting about Linus as a personality. I think what probably makes him very successful as a kernel maintainer is that he doesn't really look too far ahead. Like he's not a big vision kind of person, right? Like he is very much in the weeds, getting the details right, making sure things run correctly. So they basically look 1 to 2 releases ahead. And a big thing about that is like he was talking about here, like it's been 20 years for the Linux real-time project, and they're hoping this year they're going to get the main patches in, right? So this is a project that's been running on the side for 20 years. And he talked about like kernel development. Actually, like a huge amount of the development takes place outside the kernel in parallel. And then when they get those windows open, it comes in and it seems like it's very quick, but there's a long incubation process, often outside the mainline kernel. But yeah, just like the kernel team itself, like they're only focusing 1 or 2 releases ahead at any time.
I've heard the Fedora project lead talk about that too. It's like, this is all open source volunteer work. I can't possibly give you a time frame for when something will be done, because it's like on their own time. Now I realize the kernel is like, much more professional than that. We have Intel and people like that are getting paid to work on the kernel. But what if, that's completely outside of Linus's control though. So like looking far ahead, like, oh yeah, in 10 years, we're going to have this or that, assuming these people still decide to spend their free time on it and don't just like buy a Mac or something, like.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of kernel developers now are being paid by these companies, because it's a pretty rigid schedule. Like it's not something you can just drop in and drop a patch in or something like that. It's like you have to have it ready and at the opening of a window to make sure it's everything's correct about it. So yeah, it's not a trivial thing.
The last numbers I saw that about 80% of the kernel developers were being paid by corporations, and that was just like 4 or 5 years ago.
You're
Probably
really
gone up.
Yeah, you really need consistent investment because a huge amount is just maintenance, right? Which is not glamorous work, right? Like it's, looking at bug reports, reproducing it, documenting. So it really requires consistent investment over long periods of time.
You know who they're not being paid by is the Linux Foundation. I don't know if you all saw that recently, but like apparently the Linux Foundation only spends 2% of its budget on the Linux kernel. Which I saw that and I was just amazed. That's incredible.
Well, they're like a big business, right? They run all these huge conferences like the KubCons, which are 10,000 people, the Linux Cons, Open Source Summit, which is a good conference to go to if you've never gone to it, if you're like into Linux. But yeah, it's they run a lot of events, training, so they're a multi-million-dollar organization. And in many ways, the Linux, it's almost like a vendor organization too, right? Like putting a stamp of approval on things. All right. The next thing, I know this is a lot of text here, but this is kind of what he was talking about, the release process. So as they said, they do basically a roughly 9-week release cycle, which means 1 year they'll have 5 releases, the next year they'll have 6. And as I mentioned before, the major version, about every 20, Linus says whenever he runs out of toes and fingers, that's when he decides to update the version. And really for the folks who've been here, we have some folks who've been with Linux a long time who remember the old days when it was like a year or two between kernels. When it first started, there was like, they tried to do a kernel a year. Once it started getting really big, like in the 2.x reach. And anybody who knows software is like when you wait for software to have certain features, then it could drag out, right? You keep delaying the release. So he initially tried to release every 6 weeks, and then they've backed to 9 weeks, and they've been doing that for about 17 to 20 years, right? This process that I documented in Greg's presentation, where they have open up the window, all the patches come into Linus's mainline, and then they do release candidates for the next 9 weeks and then release. They've been doing that for a very long time now, and they're very good at it. So it's like a machine right now, and I don't think it's going to change.
Did anybody in these talks go into the fact that like Linux doesn't use Git, like they don't use Git as part of their process? That's what I heard, is that like even though Linus created Git, he doesn't use it on the kernel, which I find fascinating.
But I'm pretty sure they do. What would they use?
I think they just email patches, don't they? Patch series.
We could take a look at that after this talk, because I have some links to the release policy, so we could take a look.
I thought that Linux kernel was based on Git for version control, and transporting patches back and forth, that is entirely different than the version control system. There are ways to make that happen.
Oh, okay. So they use Git for everything. Okay, so they use Git on their machine, and then they have Git generate a patch series and email it or something.
That would be my assumption.
Gotcha.
This was a talk that came up, like it was basically, this year Linux has taken over, the Linux project has taken over CVEs. And something important here is that, again, they address bugs really quickly, but they don't want to prioritize like these security features, or have to wait on like, making notifications and things like that. Big drive of Linux is to support more hardware all the time. So they're constantly releasing new kernels. And obviously it was becoming super painful to have outside organizations like creating CVEs against Linux. So they've taken it all in-house now with, Greg leading the charge and the maintainers getting, after triage. So yeah. Yeah, so this is actually interesting that these two talks kind of reflected on each other. Linus's talk came after Greg's. His was the day before. But Linux, they fix bugs very quickly, and that's what he said here. That's why they do a 7-day. Like they're not going to do a 90-day delay embargo on announcing a fix, right? Or they had one that extended to 400 days. It's basically, that's why, again, you see this kind of rigidity in the Linux. And it's not really rigid. It's just that they stick to their standards and that they're not going to let outside influences delay them, right? Like it's like they're shipping on a code, they're fixing code, you get a certain amount of time and then you move on. And of course, we talked about here, hardware, obviously, the other side of it. He also mentioned that, when you have like processor bugs that, are very deep into the processor, it takes a long time to get it addressed, especially, there could be national security implications and things like that. So, all right. So this is a question folks were asking about LTS versus like being just unstable, right? And so Dirk asked, what's going on there, right? What's the best thing to do? Old kernel with backports or new kernel? And I think they're kind of, what he said here is like the companies that stay back end up paying for it. That it may seem like it's better in the short term, but in the long term, it's a lot more work to just to jump and keep up with the newest versions. As Linux is moving pretty quickly. So for the folks who are asking about that, I think this is why I feel that they're going to start more and more just moving to like rolling, that you're going to be at most, within a year or so or a couple of months of the newest kernel across the board.
I see conflicts with things like PCI and other certifications of systems. You've got people installing an application called big Oracle database or something on whatever, and it's got certain version constraints, like it's certified for a certain version of something. Maybe say it's 5 point whatever, you may be able to roll forward in the 5 series, but I think you're going to start seeing problems rolling your kernel to another major version, at least with the current support model for some big applications.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, obviously you've seen up to now, like the Linux kernel team, they just like to rock and roll. They'll just keep shipping, and so it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out. The new policy was just announced last year, so the older kernels are still in support, but they're going to start dropping off here in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that coincides with, I think the news about the kernel LTS like cutting back, and the news that the Linux Foundation only spends 2% of its budget on Linux. I think those like came to my attention at the same time, right? So it's like, we can't support our kernels longer because that's too hard and expensive, but we have a Linux Foundation who spends like barely no money on the Linux kernel. So couldn't we just get them to like increase it to 5 or maybe 10% of their budget, and then we could have these long-term support kernels? Like I don't know. I just the allocation of resources there for something called the Linux Foundation might be a bit skewed, but it's just my opinion. It's not really based on much.
Well, it's funded a lot by the different vendors, right? So the vendors probably are fine with short. And I'll say this is happening with us too, right? Like open source is moving to shorter and shorter support windows because if you want the long-term support, you're going to have to pay for it. Right, that's it's expensive to do. So that's going to be a trend I think we're going to see across our industry. The people who care about remaining on older kernels are usually the people like the governments and large corporations who can afford support contracts that are in the millions of dollars.
That's true. And like how you started the talk off with, there's so many abstractions now between the kernel and whatever you're running, which on one hand is like, fine, upgrade the kernel. It doesn't really affect me on my, deploying apps on EKS. But then, it kind of does, because now everything in that stack is moving so fast. Like, I feel like I have to upgrade my EKS on Amazon like every, 3 months. They're like, and if you don't upgrade, they like start charging you 6 times more than your original cost. And so like, okay, so the kernel's moving faster, but so is everything on top of it. And I'm having to like keep churning them all now, like, so it does get a little bit tiresome.
Yeah, the AX box that hasn't been upgraded in like 6 years sounds really good. I'm just saying.
Yeah. And also, I don't know if this is true for every company, but I've seen a lot of companies where they know exactly what version of stuff you're on in the cloud, right? Because they have that all like monitored and closely watched. But meanwhile, you're running RHEL 5 on-prem and nobody even knows about it, so they don't hit you up on that. So of course, the company I'm working for now would never do something like that, but the ones before,
Yeah.
Hey, Stephen,
Yes.
I have a question. So how has IBM's closed door policy with Red Hat and all their development code affected what's going on in the kernel itself?
I don't know. I mean, do we have any red? I personally, like, as I said before, I consume Linux kernels usually via immutable operating systems. So like, whether it's EKS or Kind or something like that, it's it's the cloud vendor packages it up for me nowadays, or I have, a Google Linux instance that I use for development. So I'm not really sure what has changed in the IBM days or what Red Hat is doing.
Yeah, because what I understood was that IBM, after acquiring Red Hat, decided to, because it was making a lot of a lot of input to the kernel, and evidently IBM decided to not release it. And I don't know if that has changed since I had learned that. So that's the reason why I'm asking is how is IBM affecting the code?
Yeah, do we have any Red Hat Enterprise folks? One thing Greg said, he said that 80% of all Linux kernels are like Debian or Ubuntu or Alpine. Is a very small percentage that's actually running like a Red Hat.
Wow.
Yeah.
That seems like it's very different from the old days.
Yeah.
Say that again.
He said from cloud vendors that like just these are on VMs or something, but like something like 80% of instances are just running an open source distribution like Debian or Ubuntu.
That doesn't surprise me because Red Hat and licensing for it really alters where it's used. It'd be interesting to see similar numbers with SUSE supported. Because, I mean, look at all your Raspberry Pis and all the people running minimum version VPSs for things. And they're not like, how many on this call are paying for a license for Red Hat or SUSE? I'd be willing to bet most of us are running free distros.
At home or at work? Because it's a different answer. At home, of course, I'm not going to pay, but at work.
Right. I'll be back in a minute.
Yeah. And just in general, like deployment patterns in the enterprise are changing, right? Like, so for Red Hat, they're having a lot of customers be on OpenShift, right? Or in the cloud, you're having a lot of people either running in Lambdas or Fargate or EKS, right? Like, so the virtual machine workloads are being more and more abstracted out, right? Like, you're just going to get an auto scaling group that's disposable. So even Linux itself, the kind of workloads you see in the enterprise are changing. See here. This was interesting. They talked about it because they're in China, and China obviously produces an enormous amount of devices. And basically it was like, get off those. So, and I think it was 4.19 kernels. I put 4.9 here, but I think they said 4.19. It wasn't clear from the transcript. And then this was an interesting thing here too. It was about Rust in the kernel. I don't know if there's anybody here who's about Rust, but there's a big push to start getting it included in the kernel. That's gone a little slower than they expected. they said with the 6.10 release was the first time that the upstream compiler could be used. Before they had to have like special version checks. And the other thing too is just cultural, right? Like a lot of the senior developers grew up in C, and if you're not familiar with Rust, it has a lot of different, like it's very opinionated, and it, enforces a lot of controls in terms of like, borrowing, and things like that. So it's more complex than something like C when you first come to it. So that's been slower too. So this is just a general question about Rust in the kernel, but we may start seeing it accelerate after this release. Anybody here use Rust?
I don't use Rust, but I did hear that the Rust maintainer stepped down recently for the Linux kernel. So adoption might slow down rather than speed up in the near future, I guess. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Rust was a super hot language, and I think it's cooled off a little bit now, just because, or it's probably settling into the use cases where it's the best, But yeah, C is, I mean, we're still back with C, like Unix and C, we're still back with like 1970s technology, which is really interesting. Like, it's usually in our industry, the first thing that works is what we stick with. Okay.
My
This one was good.
failure, I had intended to notify the Rust language group here in St. Louis about tonight's talk, and I failed to do it. But for those of you who weren't aware, there had been a Rust language group, and they actually had co-hosted a talk with us right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was one of the very early ones, and they had actually been a group that had met regularly as a physical meeting, not online. And when COVID hit, they very rapidly kind of shut down and eventually just ceased. The guy that we had talked to then, the coordinator, he wound up moving to Europe, and so he was kind of out of the loop. And it was just this last year that somebody new moved into town and said, well, damn it, I like the idea of the Rust group. Why isn't this running? And he kicked it back in. So they've actually been meeting, I think tomorrow. No, let me think here. Yeah, I think it is tomorrow night's their meeting. It's on our calendar. And I keep meaning to maybe invite them to sometime do a presentation or a joint meeting with us, just to give us all a little Rust experience. So yeah, hopefully that'll be forthcoming.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like after COVID, as we said before, I feel like a lot of the meetups have just like evaporated. Like there's not as many in-person meetings anymore anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this was kind of funny. Basically, Linus just thought he was like at a Linux conference, and they're like, oh, you're at an AI KubCon. And he's like, the only thing that matters is the kernel. I don't care about anything else, which is really interesting about his personality, because he's hyper-focused, right? He doesn't, like want to chase the next best thing, or not the next best thing, but like the next thing that comes up, the next thing in the hype cycle. He's perfectly happy just to focus on the kernel and do nothing else. So he said this obviously jokingly, but it was pretty funny. They're talking about the specialization too, right? Like now that Moore's law is kind of fading and scaling. So it was a cloud question, right? So Dirk is asking him, we're at KubCon here. What do we? And the thing that Linus really said here is like, he's a kernel person, right? And the only thing he cares about is like how to make those workloads work better with Linux. But he's not really interested in cloud or AI or anything else. He's going to remain focused on what he's doing. So things like Kubernetes they could just be up there. It doesn't matter. So just a little bit about his personality that I think is we can muse on at the end of this, because probably what makes him a very good maintainer. So this one, this was really interesting. I put this up. I didn't know whether to put this picture up or not, because about a decade ago, NVIDIA was really bad about supporting Linux, and he got very mad and had a kind of uncharacteristic kind of angry moment back then. He said with NVIDIA's actually become one of the best contributors to Linux. So I probably, maybe I should remove this image because it's not, but I just think it's just how things can change, right? Like they went from, not being great. And a lot of companies were not great at open source in the past and have really, stepped up. But yeah, NVIDIA has become one of the biggest contributors. And so, yeah, that was kind of one of the things, a side thing. I think people who've been around a while remember when this happened. There's some bad blood for a while there, and NVIDIA didn't work so well with Linux. They had a closed source driver. So I think they've been working on fixing that.
Yeah, it turns out when you make all the money, you can spend like a tiny fraction of it on making your Linux support better. I mean, I don't think there's a coincidence between NVIDIA just cranking out tons of money, being like the company who supplies the hardware for all this AI stuff that's happening in the last 2 years, and them suddenly becoming better open source citizens. Like, I'm pretty sure thanks to the buku dollars they have coming in, they just finally decided to fund some kind of program or team internally that will do this with the kernel. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into the tea leaves there, but I think there's a pretty straight line there between one to the other.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point of view. It's also that like NVIDIA's business has changed, right? Like they came in selling like graphics cards for games, right? Essentially, or CAD. And this whole CUDA thing about you could use it for processing, and as AI has grown, they become more of a server company. So they had to change, right? Like having proprietary drivers may not matter as much when your main business is like serving large businesses. That's not what they care about. So,
Yeah, I mean, talk about playing the long game on that one too, right? Didn't CUDA like initially come out like so long ago, but man, it is paying off now. They have the most vendor lock-in with that. Maybe across the whole IT industry. Like,
Yeah.
like they have vendor lock-in that Apple can only dream of with CUDA.
Yeah, that's a good point. So then he asked about AI, and it was really interesting what Linus thought about AI. He's not really interested in it, but what they've been thinking about is, can they use it? Like you saw the amazing demonstration before. What they're thinking about is within Linux itself, can they use it for like pull requests? Like can they train it on the Linux kernel? And when someone opens up a pull request, it says whether this is good or not, right? So that's basically where he sees it. And he talks to a lot of people in the industry, but they don't see it as necessarily a code generation tool at the current time, but basically helping them with the maintainers and, verifying patches and things like that. All right. Yeah, basically the same thing here. I think I'm not going to go too much into it here. That they have a lot of simple tools right now that flag errors. He's hoping that with LLMs, they could have stronger tools. I think that might be the final questions. So this is funny. Dirk asked ChatGPT to ask him some questions for Linus, and it came out with this. This is really says a lot about Linux. I mean, Linus himself personally, he's like, he's not a vision person, right? Like he said, he's a plotting engineer, and he's proud of that, right? Like he sees himself as an engineer. He's focused on the task at hand, and he doesn't. Which is really, I think, refreshing in an industry, if you're in IT, there's a lot of hype and BS around a lot of things in our industry because there's so much money and opportunity sloshing around. And, for 33 years now, he's been focused on shipping kernels, focused on the kernel, making the kernel work better. And he's not looking in the future or anything. He's just focused on that. And he's very proud of doing that. And I think that's what makes him a very strong maintainer. So yeah, and then I think that's basically the final thoughts, right? And then we can talk about or go to the presentation. But yeah, I see him like it's very much a master craftsman, intense focus. When someone's been doing a single craft for decades, they become really masterful at it. The project management, I think, is probably one of the most impressive things in the software industry, just the sheer velocity of shipping that they do, and the process. And I think that's really a good lesson in terms of as software projects scale up, it really starts becoming into the management of the project itself, of how you get things done. Yeah, and then in an industry full of hype and BS, he's very happy in his niche and he's doing really well. So that is a summary of the talk. So yeah, I encourage everybody to go watch the talk. It's pretty great. All right.
Thank you, Stephen. I did go out and follow the link and actually look at the actual talks. But I really appreciated your commentary on it because it did yeah, definitely highlighted some other things, some different aspects, and I thought it was really good. So thank you. It's a
Yeah.
good additional view. So
Well, thanks for having me.
This is Stan. I think that your
well, if
commentary.
anybody else has a question, just jump in there and ask. In the meantime, I'm going to ask either Stephen or anybody else who knows. So,
well, Stan was. I think Stan was asking a question.
Oh, go ahead, Stan.
I was going to say that this commentary that is separate from actually following parallel with the worked better than showing parts of Linus's talk and then going into it is much better because it allowed people here to give their commentary on the slides that you presented. So, Stephen, that it worked out much better than I thought it would. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
This is Randy. I just wanted to say,
I think earlier at one point, probably from the CVE talk, I think maybe you showed a little clip of how many lines of code there were and how many actual subroutines or routines there were in the Linux code. I'm curious, so do we have any idea how many actual maintainers or developers there are in the world, since they don't work in one particular organization? They're contributors from different companies or different places.
Linus said in the talk that there were 1,000 people contributing to the kernel, thereabouts.
Yeah, I heard about 2,000 with 200 maintainers, new maintainers every release.
Randy, Van Houston, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, basically what I wanted to say was, first of all, great talk. Nicely done. One of the things that I learned from not only what you had to say, but it's proven in the industry that when you practice, that you become the best at what you do. And he's proven that in his field. And I think that's part of the reason why Linux is so good, because he started out, as a young kid and as a graduate of college, and said, okay, let me do this project. And the next thing you know, it's become a life project. So.
And he's still doing it 33 years later. It's incredible. Like it's at such a high level for so long. That's what I say. To me, he strikes me as a master craftsman, right? Like he's still very passionate about doing the very best he can with it. So yeah, I think that's the most impressive that I got, because I haven't really seen, I haven't really seen Linus talk a lot, like maybe a couple short videos, but to see him for extended time was very interesting.
Have we resolved the question of if Linux uses Git? Or
not to dwell on that point about how many developers? Anybody got numbers of how many developers there are in like FreeBSD or Microsoft land?
FreeBSD and listen to some of their talks. Their development group is much smaller, but they are some hardcore guys that have been doing it just as long, making sure that FreeBSD, because that's what I follow more than Open or Net, that it does what it does well, and it has turned to be an operating system because of the different license for like network routers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because even some of the old guys were criticized during the 20 or 30 some years that even the default installer from FreeBSD projects does not even to this day have a graphics installer. It's still sort of a it's text-based. It doesn't scroll up the screen. It's got a menu-based system, but it still isn't some flashy, gooey wizard thing. But they don't think it's necessary for what it is. And to actually install a desktop, they'll let some effectively downstream make it. So Ghost BSD, if you want to pre-install the desktop, there's a lot of seriousness in between both groups, but they do think slightly different. There is a different philosophy in between the MIT license and the GNU license.
Okay. Okay.
So I looked it up. It's over 2,000.
Yeah, and it looks like to start with Linux, you there's a Git repo that you start with. So maybe just they pass patches through, and then I think that's pretty interesting.
But a comment on the 50 developers. I watched something from Linus within the last couple of months, but it was a video, a YouTube video from about 8 years ago. He actually used 3 numbers. About a dozen some people are hardcore people that he talks to every day. 50 people are people that are constantly in the kernel, and the 1,000 or whatever number is some people that have come up with some sort of patch that does get all the way through to be approved and applied. So to him at the time that he gave the speech, it's like 3 different numbers, depending on how intensely they're involved in being a kernel developer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's distributed, right? There's maintainers for separate parts of the kernel.
Hmm. So, Stephen, from either the 2 talks you've highlighted here, or if you care to even think of other things in the conference, what was the thing that surprised you most?
I think the scale, so I was mostly on the Kube side. I think the scale of a lot of edge stuff is going on, like, in terms of what developers in China are focused on, and the ones who came there, like, it's a lot of edge devices, like in terms of like NIO, the car company, they're using Kube Edge, and putting that in, like, just managing millions of devices, right, and centrally, and how you do that. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work about running huge AI models and like using that within Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is really becoming like this massive distributed operating system, right? In much the way that Linux is. Like, it's Kubernetes is that next layer up that like companies are basing everything on. At least that's what it feels like. So I think that was, they had real-time translations, right? Because if you spoke in English, they translated in real time to Chinese and the other way back, right? So I thought that was pretty slick. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, that there's a lot of really good work going on there, like a lot of distributed learning, edge devices, scheduling. I think those are like the big themes that I saw coming up. So yeah. And the kernel just keeps rocking and rolling.
Nice.
How was your talk? Have you ever given a talk at that big of a crowd before? Or?
Oh yeah, no, this was actually not too, yeah, it's, so I try to give talks a lot, especially since I could go to different places when I give a talk. So I tend to give talks a few times a year. So this was fine. I did it with my coworker. It was a decent talk. It was mostly to get to Hong Kong and to, the talk went really well. The demos went perfectly. So we practiced a lot though. So yeah. And we did all about testing patterns, which is something very useful to our customers, even if it's not kind of dry material. But yeah, I've spoken in Bologna, Paris this year, a bunch of other places I don't even know. So I get to work. Yeah, so I work remotely, so that's one of my travel things. I get to go around.
Nice. And you
Yeah.
started off talking about clusters. You said something about clusters, and I was wondering what you meant by that. When you were talking about you have clusters of things that you're controlling with HCL or something. And I know that like Kubernetes, like there's pods, which are like a group, but then there's nodes in a cluster, right? But then is that what you're talking about, or was there another layer?
The layer we're working on is something called Crossplane, which sits on top of Kubernetes, and it basically allows Kubernetes to manage anything outside the cluster. So we take like the Kubernetes API and the controller runtime that's built into everything, and we build like AWS and Azure providers on top of it. Because a lot of companies are starting to move everything into Kubernetes, right? So now a developer, when they deploy their app, they could just ask for like a database in a CRD and have it be provisioned. So this is obviously there's a very strong tool in this space called Terraform, but we're kind of moving towards people who are building more like enterprise platforms, internal clouds. So we tend to see pretty strong adoption among big companies for this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what I focus on. I was in infrastructure for a long time. I felt like this crossplane concept is probably one of the strongest things out there for infrastructure. And I still, we still have a lot of growing to do, but I feel like it's very well positioned.
So we had somebody from SUSE a couple of years ago talk about running VMs inside of Kubernetes. So how does that play in with what you're doing at all, or is it separate or related or not?
It's separate. We think about we use Kubernetes as a control plane. So this is an important thing. Like control planes are one of the fundamental technologies that came out of the internet, right? Like you need a single way to manage a bunch of different devices, right? Like in much way, operating system can handle multiple devices, right? And schedule work. A control plane can handle multiple things of infrastructure, right? Like you use the same API, which is a Kubernetes API to manage S3 buckets or GKE clusters or GitHub organizations, right? So the user comes, does kubectl apply, and then the controllers go off and provision it for them. And it reconciles continuously. So Crossplane is basically what's known as a universal control plane, right? And since it's based on Kubernetes, it can manage anything in a standardized way, right? Using the Kubernetes API and all the other tooling around it. So that's where we compete in. Yeah, and I think we're a very unique project and very strongly positioned. So it's, but yeah.
Well,
that's cool. So yeah, it's if you talk about Terraform and Ansible, it's kind of it's based on Kubernetes. So like in a lot of the same ways as Kubernetes replaced like VM style workloads with distributed pods and stuff, you're seeing companies now start to have their infrastructure abstracted out into controllers like this.
I think you said your title was solution architect, and I think that's the next step up for me if I want to keep going up. So what do you think about the solution architect role, and do you have any advice for a tech lead who's trying to step up that way next?
I think that there's three things to it. The first one is being technically strong. I think you showed a lot of those here too. The second one is being able to communicate technology to other people and kind of understand how things work, like for customer problems. So it's the best solution architects are people who are generally good with customers and good technically. So I think those are the skills that you need. Like, so it's, yeah, I mean, I think, creating content, a huge part of that is creating content, reference architectures, things like that. So yeah, just having experience, especially in the enterprise, is important.
Yeah, I think my hang up is AWS, because I'm pretty sure they're going to want me to be an AWS guru to be a solution architect at my current place or in many places. And man, I've tried studying some of that AWS stuff like on my spare time, but I just keep getting this feeling like I'm basically memorizing a McDonald's menu in order to become like the greatest McDonald's salesman ever and I know I shouldn't think about it that way, right? I should think about like the cool stuff that allows you to build, rapid prototyping, all that. But there's just this part in the back of my head that it's like, am I just becoming a shill for this cloud company? You know, I don't know.
Yeah, I can tell you with our providers. So we map everything in AWS into a Kubernetes object, or we cover probably 90% of the APIs for the big clouds, and AWS alone has 1,000 things that you can configure, and each one of those is like lots. So you think about S3 bucket or something, there's 900 more things within AWS to configure like that.
Yep.
And the other big clouds are like that too. So it is physically impossible to learn all this, right? Like even if you learned, there's 3,000 things between the three clouds, and it's so that's you just have to be able to learn very quickly, right? Like you just have to know the basics, and because and hope that like the 20% that's common is good enough, because otherwise it's you just have to be able to absorb information very quickly. Because I run into stuff I don't know at all. Today somebody's asking me about Azure DNS pointers. I'm like, I don't know. So I had to look it up and figure it out.
Yep. Cool. Thanks for that. Yeah, I don't know how the conversations. If anybody else has a question.
Go, Sean.
Oh no, I don't. I don't have anything else. If it's just
Okay.
Else to step up.
Just a quick background on the settings. So how many people were there at KubCon?
There was only about 350, which is not a lot, and this comes down to that they usually hold it in something like Shanghai or something like that. Hong Kong actually has a different. It's more difficult for Chinese people to attend it, whereas it's easier for Westerners. So it was smaller than normal. It was really good with some very strong engineers there. And I said we met the folks who do KCL, which is an incredibly well-run project. It's so we'll see. I mean, it may not affect the folks in the Linux space, but I think we see it as very promising in the Kubernetes space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was nice. Yeah, because usually KubeCons are like 5,000 to 15,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah.
So YAML is kind of like the JavaScript of Kubernetes, right? So like, because I'm thinking about this, think about all the UI frameworks that compile to JavaScript, because that's what runs in the browser.
Yeah.
And so now we're having languages and things that compile to YAML, because that's what runs in Kubernetes. Or that's what declared to create Kubernetes things. So
well, Kubernetes is a declarative system, right? Like, so it's you basically tell it what you want it to do. Now we have something called functions, which is we create the declarative state, but we have pipelines that actually create it, so you could have conditions and loops, because it's just raw YAML that you give Kubernetes, and you can't do anything else with it really. So you need tools around it for like dynamic. So that's part of Crossplane. It has this thing called the composition engine, where you could say like, wait until the bucket is created before you create the database. You could do things like that. So yeah, that's where it becomes a very powerful framework, right? Like that you can have custom logic running dynamically within the cluster to do things.
yeah, you mentioned Terraform earlier, and there's all this, I guess it's been going on for quite a while now, but there's this, fork, Open Tofu, which is a terrible, I think that name's terrible, but what do you think? Do you have are you backing one horse or the other about how that's going to shake out? Or I don't know. I just think it's interesting. I don't know if I really have an opinion or anything about it.
We're avoiding it. I have to say, like, we are sticking with Terraform right now until our lawyers figure things out. The CNCF has adopted OpenTofu, right? So it's a CNCF project, which is kind of the umbrella organization of Linux, of Kubernetes. But we really don't, we focus on Crossplane a lot. Like, in all honesty, it doesn't really affect us. It affects us a little bit on the one provider we have that embeds Terraform in it, but we actually got rid of the Terraform CLI, and we talked to providers directly because Terraform CLI is very inefficient. But and the newest versions of OpenTofu are slightly incompatible now with Terraform. So it'll be interesting to see which side wins. I think, I don't know. I honestly can't predict who's going to come out of that.
Yeah, and I know that somebody was asking about IBM earlier, but it might be that OpenTofu is a bit more because that's also IBM, I think, mostly behind OpenTofu as well. So maybe that'll end up being the more.
Well, IBM bought HashiCorp, right? So HashiCorp are the folks who make Terraform. They IPO'd a couple years ago. They were struggling, not struggling, but not having the explosive growth. So IBM bought them. That purchase hasn't completed yet, I don't think. But IBM will own HashiCorp after that. And they make Vault too, which is another super popular tool that a lot of folks use. And OpenTofu is basically backed by the CNCF and a bunch of companies like ENV Zero Harness, like folks who had written web GUIs on top of Terraform, like for provisioning software. So that's kind of the constellation around OpenTofu.
Because HashiCorp changed to one of these like not quite open source, but you can't make money off of us licenses, right? And that's what started the whole thing. So
yeah, it's the BSL. Yeah, they last August, I think it was, about a year now.
Right. Which I don't know, I'm still torn on those, you know, myself personally. Like I understand, like at one point I get it, right? Like if you're Elasticsearch and then Amazon implements you and takes all your money because you're trying to run a cloud thing. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, there's downsides, you know, like I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. It was hard for HashiCorp to make money on it because there's a lot of people who are, you know, selling run Terraform.
This is Stan. I'd like to remind everybody the 10-minute warning. Traditionally, we would end the meetings at 9 o'clock because they would throw us out of the restaurant or the library, things like that. We do not have to end the meeting. Things are going quite well with the discussions we're having now. So what does everybody say? Keep on going or what?
Sure.
Alternative, Sean could preview the site he's been building for us if you wanted.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll just put it on in the background while we keep talking, I guess. Sure.
Okay, that'd be great.
And I have the PDF of the presentation. How should I share it with the group?
If you
send it to
go ahead.
editor, email it to editor@slug.org, and we'll put it up on the presentation archives.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen.
Of course.
Looks like your last talk was in 2021. It was about Cozy, the common operating system interface. So it seems like this is a very similar thing to what you've been talking about to us tonight with Upscale. So I guess you've been in this common control plane lifestyle for quite a while now.
Did I talk to this group about Cozy? Is actually something I'm actually going to be in London next week, and they're going to have a conference for it. The Talos company. I think it's very exciting. Actually, it's API first Linux, right? So because Kubernetes and Docker came on and kind of abstracted out the operating system, it's really good. Like you have an API driven Linux that's basically focused on doing nothing else but running containerized workloads. Which is kind of the natural, like when I gave that talk, right? Because Unix was designed as a multi-user terminal sharing system, right? With shared file systems. And that's not what anybody needs anymore. Actually, the vast majority of workloads are either containerized or their phones or embedded devices. So the workloads that came from Unix with the serial attached terminals and all those things don't really matter, right? And having shared libraries doesn't necessarily matter anymore. So that's the idea of Cozy is API driven first Linux. So yeah, I'm not really involved in it. I'm just happened to be in London and they're going to have a Talos event, so I may go over and see it. So
wow.
Yeah.
Let me digress for just a moment, Stephen. I didn't give a very detailed introduction. So quickly tell us your company and what does your company usually do?
Our company is called Upbound. So we're the primary. So it's a company that's VC funded, right? So we're past Series B, and I approached them a few years ago. So I've actually been there for a bit now. They write cloud infrastructure automating software, right? So they wrote the Crossplane framework, which runs on top of Kubernetes. And now we have this product that we sell to companies, right? So you can imagine like a very large bank or something like that. We give them that they can run multiple control planes. Like, so what that means is that they can offer their developers like a UI to request infrastructure in a standardized way. So that's kind of it. There's this whole push right now in terms of creating internal development platforms and internal clouds. And we're one of the stronger players in that field, but it's still a forming industry. So that's what we do. Yeah, and it's, I was working, before I joined them, I was working for MasterCard out there in St. Louis here. And we had like 20 different DevOps pipelines here, and they were all terrible. And this is really like a standardized way to do it across the company. So, we're still, I think we haven't hit the hockey stick growth yet, but we're getting some massive customers in terms of the corporations who are using our software. So it's very promising.
Nice. Good for us to stay up on what you're up to.
Yeah. I've been in cloud and stuff for a while since Docker came out. That really opened my eyes about possibilities.
What was the name of your company again? I'm just updating your bio since you're talking about it. The one on the website was a bit out of date.
Let me see if I can share it here. It's upbound.io.
Wow. You.
Where's my? Yeah.
As you mentioned Docker, I'm sure the first time you spoke to us, that was I think the first time any of us had really heard about Docker and the whole concept of containerization becoming a common thing. So I remember your talk, whatever that was, I guess 4 years ago, or maybe 5. Anyway, it really opened the eyes for a number of us of where things were going. So.
Yeah, I think it was fundamental, and I think you see things in like Talos with that just new ways in CoreOS, new ways of thinking about Linux itself, right? Like that we don't get stuck in old patterns. So it was, and I kind of feel that way about this crossplane stuff. It's hard because it's a tough problem, it's complex, and we're competing against something like Terraform, which is really good. So we have to be better. But architecturally, it's probably the best thing. Right, Kubernetes is very strong right now, and it's growing. It's becoming like that layer that's, in the same way that Linux has become like just the standard, right? And it just disappears. Kubernetes is increasingly being like that too. It just, every company has it. It runs workloads consistently across every organization on the planet. So it's getting that kind of, momentum. So the next thing is, use it to manage everything aside from your applications. And that's where Crossplane will come in.
Excellent. Just as we go forward, Stan already kind of gave the traditional 10-minute warning, and that probably also is a spot where, although we love and appreciate any continued presence and contribution, if Steve can stay with us, and if anybody thinks of another question, wonderful. But either if you have to run off, Stephen, or if I can just broaden it out, if anyone has a more general question, something that doesn't apply to Stephen or even Sean's talk tonight, but just something you wanted to throw out to the group, hey, I was working on this week and this didn't work, or anybody got any ideas on this? Now would probably be an appropriate time to open your mouth and ask a question.
Well, I have one question. This is Randy again. I'm just wondering what you think is kind of the future look like.
While people are thinking about that, Stan, any final words from you tonight?
Oh, somebody else was asking a question.
Okay. Yeah, is that Randy?
Yes. Yeah.
Randy, ask away.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm asked. My question is, I wanted to know if
Randy, I'm not hearing your voice. I don't know if your
I hear him,
microphone's
though.
open. You do hear him. Okay.
Yeah.
all right, let me move this up. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Now I hear you. Uh-huh.
Okay. I just moved the microphone up. So basically my question to Stephen is, do you know what the future looks like for the kernel and anything new that you expect to see coming or directions?
Yeah, I think the kernel's increasingly going to be put to the kind of workloads that you see that where all the money is, right? Who's going to pay for development, and that's cloud, AI, and those kind of workloads. And I think, and I think like you folks talk about things like here, like Debian and Red Hat, and like their traditional Linux OSs. I do feel like those aren't getting as much investment, right? Like the traditional workloads on a VM are kind of stagnant, I think. So I think you're going to see more and more the kind of workloads that are containerized or GPU centric, like a designed to run. And when I mean GPU centric, designed to run in large processing clusters, right, where they can run their models and train them across thousands of servers. So you're seeing a lot of work. You see that with the scheduler here. Like there's lots of work going on everywhere in terms of like scalability across Linux nodes. And that's just going to increase. So I don't know how that's going to affect, like Linus doesn't have the big vision, right? Like he just focused on the core engine and making it run well. So I think that's where it's going to go.
I'm just wondering if you see any improvements in drivers that are probably not as common, like fingerprint scanners or fingerprint readers. Some of the maybe even POS type tools.
It's hard to say because a lot of this stuff, I think there's a clash between like hobbyist Linux versus corporate Linux, right? And it's who's paying for the development. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I was doing some research in the past, and it looked like for like even for something like Debian, the number of people contributing has been pretty much flat for the last decade. So I think it depends a lot, like who's going to be writing those drivers and including them and everything.
Is it the same people, or is it the same number of people leaving and it's coming in?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of people are older. It's the open source revolution really started kicking off in like the 90s, right? So you have a lot of people now who are like in the prime of their careers who are doing it.
Do you think that's part of what? Do you think that people have come more complacent because things just work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's just part of maturing technology. Like I can't remember the last time I cared about a Linux kernel version, right? It was probably in the 5, as I said before, when like figuring out when Docker was coming out and, for layered file systems. But aside from that, like the way Kubernetes consumes the Linux kernel, there hasn't been a lot of changes, right? So, obviously there's like, GPU stuff is becoming very big right now, but it's not, that's what I'm saying. Linux has become so mature that, they're just shipping constantly, and it's just the maturity of the product, right? Like or the project that they're not breaking things, and there's not big changes coming. We'll see with the Rust. I mean, they're still coming through, right? We'll see with Rust coming into the kernel. We'll see with this scheduler. But those seem like kind of niche applications that really just hit a few people.
I played with Rust, but in what you're referring to, I'm not really visualizing how that applies. Because I had a question earlier that even though C is a very old language, the GCC that we would download today and write some simple applications or tools And I think different than you do, because you're thinking on corporate wide cloud-based applications that you would drown in details if you had to configure every last Linux server. But Linux has still remained in small computer space. I'm going to have to change my career because I already have. Me being a system admin in a small shop doesn't really exist much anymore. But I was able, because I had a hardware background, move a little bit sideways and find work. But I'm talking about running Linux on a small machine like an ESP32, controlling some sort of device, whether it's a 3D printer, a laser cutter, or whatever. And Linux isn't going to evacuate that space, but people working that space don't think like you, and vice versa.
Well, no, it's not. Linux is going to be the dominant operating system for pretty much everything. It's really the what's running on top of it, right? And I think the traditional use case where like you log into Linux and you have a GUI and things like that, or you use it as a server, those are kind of shrinking a little bit, where it's either an embedded device that has like a firmware flashed onto it, or it's just a node in a cluster that could get replaced. So it's kind of different. That's the difference of Linux, is, where most of the workloads are going. The thing where you like, put rack and stack a Linux box or launch a Linux VM, those use cases are not as, they're becoming less common.
But a lot of the development is slowed down because a lot of that, like was mentioned, is all mature.
Yeah.
You don't need to download a new copy of LibreOffice if you're a home office or small office. Pretty much if your copy of LibreOffice works just fine, you're not updating it weekly. So if you're a small charity or something and you're using Linux because you don't have a bunch of licensing issues, you're still going to run a simple LAMP stack. The mention of Alpine has less licensing problems if you install it on one $6 or $7 instance because you want it to do a backup. That's the extra bug. You're going to run a simple LAMP stack, and it's easy to deploy one in about 7 minutes, because that's what I run. But a lot of me, I'm partially retired, so I'm not working in corporate America anymore, and I don't really worry about the latest RHEL certification, because I'm finding in the Orlando area I couldn't find a job anyway. But I'm finding that what is sort of slowly returning to the United States are, you can find places that still are making printed circuit boards, because even though it's cheap to make in China, you still want to do some stuff where you don't have to go through that. Now, if you make a bunch of production boards, it's cheaper than etching your own boards, but there's still a lot of small stuff still being done in this place, because there are small machine shops and other stuff that would use a Linux, but they're still talking to some sort of device. Now, if they have some online sales presence, they'll go, farm that out to a big company, and then they'll rent that piece of computer and pay for it, and it will be something spun up in Azure or Google Cloud or AWS.
Yeah, I think it's just new use cases, right? Like if you look at the embedded device, usually they're just a flashed operating system, right? They build it and they pack it and they ship it down. So you're not really maintaining it. You just go from A to B and back and forth. So increasingly Linux is very just immutable. And just like a core kernel with just a few services around it. So
the stuff that I played with Linux, other than my VMs, is I own a couple Raspberry Pis and I installed home automation on it. And if I want some specialized tool, like I can't off the shelf today, even ordering from China, find a couple devices that work exactly the way I want to. If I had a hot water heater and I wanted to monitor that it wasn't leaking because it would flood my garage, I could, with the simple tool of either an Arduino, then interface to a ESP32, come up with a dedicated sensor that could monitor my hot water heater. But for me to simply go buy that, I'm going to have to mangle something that's similar. There's still some quote unquote kitchen table development by it, and yes, some of it is hobby based, some of it's amateur radio based, but there is that still small scale stuff happening. And no, it doesn't have any of the budgets of the big cloud stuff, and I don't ever expect it will. It's a niche market for niche little projects.
Yeah. It's amazing actually that we have this for all this stuff free. It's incredible. It's a very good point.
But back on the Rust thing, what is actually being added to the kernel? Because Rust itself, both Cargo is your overall maintainer, and Rust C, which I did play with, not in kernel space, but in user space. And it was an arm wrestling session to get that Rust compiler to do something I could easily have done in Python or Ruby in 1/3 the time. Now it's inexperience that adds up to some of those hours, but Rust is real anal on what it passes. It wants to make sure there is no errors, and it really is an arm wrestling session to get it to even to compile something until you pick all those nits.
Yeah, so Rust, this is one of the challenges why the developers are not accepting it, but Rust is much more safe, right? Like it's has a lot of memory safety things that can eliminate entire classes of bugs that C creates. So that's the hope. But yeah, it's a whole new way of programming. It has like ML's kind of language, you know, some functional things in it. So it's definitely more, as you commented there, it's more complex to program. So that's kind of the struggle.
I have an analogy for it. Playing with that Rust compiler to just do some simple scripting I had done in the past in other languages was like having your mother-in-law nag you from the back seat of the car about your driving.
Did you folks get my email, the PDF? Just
Yes, we did.
perfect.
Thank you.
Cool.
I love the mother-in-law idea. That's the visualization. Thank you.
Slow down, speed up, get up more in the other lane.
Yeah, Rust is very strict. So yep. It's
I
hard.
think
And we have an industry that's going towards complexity and specialization, right? Like, so cloud is complex, these distributed Kubernetes is complex, these, you know, these applications, web applications are getting more and more complex. So we're just seeing a lot of specialization in our industry, where, you know, all the interactions between everything is getting increasingly, it's complex. Like it's, you know, they like to pretend like computer science is all like algorithms and stuff, but 90% of your time is just stitching together different frameworks and APIs. And there's a lot of complexity in all those interactions.
well,
and-
this is Stan, and I'm ready to end the meeting. If
Thank you so much for everybody's time. I really appreciated it.
we
Hey, thank you, Stephen. This was really, really great. It was almost like we were in Hong Kong. I mean, we kind of got the experience and the view. I loved it. So
Yeah, it was
I
great.
think everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, Stephen. And put a bookend here on the recording. This has been Wednesday, the 11th of September, 2024. This has been the St. Louis Linux Unix Users Group, SLUUG.org, our regular general monthly meeting. And Stephen Borrelli has been our main speaker tonight. He just came back from the conference in Hong Kong and gave us some wonderful information, both from Linus Torvalds' keynote and also from the session on Linux kernel CVEs. So we really appreciate that. Our tutorial this evening was from Sean Treehouse, and he gave us some good AI tools. Gemini and Vercel, and we appreciate those. And with that, thank you all for coming, and good night.
At this point, I'm going to end the recording if I can find the button.